And what the penalty is going to be, if you burn a flag, you get 1 year in jail, no early exits, no nothing. You get 1 year in jail. If you burn a flag, you get, and what it does is incite to riot. I hope they use that language, by the way. Did they?
Yeah, incitement.
Incite to riot. And you burn a flag, you get 1 year in jail. You don't get 10 years, you don't get 1 month. You get 1 year in jail, and it goes on your record.
Greetings and welcome to the Lancaster Patriot Podcast. My name is Chris Hume. This episode is brought to you by Future of Christendom, and I encourage you to go to futureofchristendom.org to sign up while you still can for the No Other Name Conference. This is Future of Christendom's annual conference taking place October 9th, 10th, and 11th here in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Speakers include Jeff Durbin, Eli Ayala, John Bingaman, Joel Saint, Matt Kennitzer, and many more. There's still some seats available, so I encourage you to go over to futureofchristendom.org. Just scroll down. You'll see the link for conference registration. Tickets are going fast, so get your tickets today. As part of that conference, I will be participating in a 2-on-2 debate. Luke Saint and I will represent the Christian side, and we have found two local atheists here in Lancaster County to represent the atheist side, if you will. And the debate thesis will be, does the Christian God exist? So I'm really looking forward to that debate. I think it will be very interesting. I hope you can make it. Luke and I did have a chance to sit down with our two debate opponents a couple weeks ago. We went to Mission Barbecue, which, by the way, Mission Barbecue, if you have never been there, I highly recommend it. Get the brisket, moist brisket. Do not get the lean or dry brisket. It is not worth it. Moist brisket. The more fat, the better. But I will say I was shocked to find when I went there, they were out of brisket that night. So that is a faux pas for Mission Barbecue to be out of their best item, the moist brisket. I think they were out of all brisket. But in any case, I do recommend Mission Barbecue, the moist brisket with the Smoky Mountain barbecue sauce. Absolutely phenomenal. But Luke and I did have a chance to sit down with Wilson and Wayne, who will be our debate opponents, and we're looking forward to a 2-on-2 debate, Christians versus atheists. So I think it'll be a nice ending to the conference. I think some of the addresses, especially from Jeff Durbin and Eli Ayala, will cover some of the themes that I think will come up again in the debate. The transcendental argument for the existence of God, the impossibility of the contrary, things like that. I think it'll be an interesting exchange of ideas during that debate. So I hope to see you there. Again, futureofchristendom.org. Sign up now for the No Other Name Conference. There will be a singles mixer as well. So if you or someone you know is a single Christian looking to find a godly spouse, sign up for the singles mixer. This is the first singles mixer we are doing. I talked to several people who've been to other singles mixers at different Reformed conferences and trying to make this one as edifying and profitable as possible. So there might not be a ton of people at this, but we already have several signups for the singles mixer, both guys and gals. So we're still looking for some more people. So I encourage you, if you are single or if you know someone who is single, to add the singles mixer ticket as an add-on after you register for the conference. For guys, it's $25. For ladies, it's just $1 for the singles mixer. And there's also a Friday fellowship dinner open to anyone. There's an small additional price. We tried to keep, almost everything at cost for this conference. It's very affordable. If you go to futureofchristendom.org, click on the registration link, you'll see the registration price and also the add-on price. And we are certainly not making a profit from this conference, but our goal is to edify Christians, bring Christians together, encourage fellowship, edification, and proclaim the name of Christ. So I hope to see you this October 9th, 10th, and 11th here in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Well, today I want to talk about three things on this episode, and this will be rather brief, perhaps, for each of these things. I want to talk about something that I just saw just about an hour ago. This is Trump's executive order on the burning of the American flag. So this is from whitehouse.gov. It says, prosecuting burning of the American flag. This is an executive order from August 25th, 2025. So I'm recording this on August 26th, so just one day ago. And let me just read a portion of this. By the authority vested in me as president by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, it is hereby ordered. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but let me just read a little bit. Section 1, purpose. Our great American flag is the most sacred and cherished symbol of the United States of America and of American freedom, identity, and strength. Over nearly 2.5 centuries, many thousands of American patriots have fought, bled, and died to keep the stars and stripes waving proudly. The American flag is a special symbol in our national life that should unite and represent all Americans of every background and walk of life. Desecrating it is uniquely offensive and provocative. It is a statement of contempt, hostility, and violence against our nation, the clearest possible expression of opposition to the political union that preserves our rights, liberty, and security. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing. I believe, and don't quote me on this, I believe that Trump is arguing for or issuing the penalty to be 1 year in prison for anyone who is found guilty of burning the American flag. I'm not sure if the order gets into the penalty for it. Now, let me just say, I am not a fan of burning the American flag. I am not promoting burning the American flag. I have no interest in burning the American flag. I think it's distasteful. I would probably join in a general cultural condemnation of the practice of burning the American flag. But I wanted to point this out because it reveals something about our American system and some of the problems of our American system. The American flag may, in fact, be, in our American system, the most sacred and cherished symbol of the United States of America. But it should not be a sacred thing when it comes to the law of the land. So once you set up anything other than God's law as the standard of justice, you are going to have things like this come up. Now, the issue is not that I want to go burn the American flag. Again, I have no interest in doing that. But when you set up anything other than Christ and his law word as the most sacred thing in society, something else will take its place. Now, it might be better, we could say, if it's the American flag as opposed to something else, but we are still essentially setting up an idol. And we're saying that this is, Trump is saying at least, this is the most sacred and cherished symbol of the United States of America. And if that's the case, we certainly have a problem in America. And we do have a problem in America. But this is sort of, this is an example of the problem. It's a small example, and it's not one that I would spend a ton of time on, but it is an example of the problem we have in the American system that has rejected Christ and his law and has set up this American system. And you even see it in this brief statement that if you desecrate the flag, you're opposing our political union that preserves our rights, liberty, and security. That's important. I mean, that reminds me of the war between the states. And the great crime of the southern states was not, from the northern perspective, their great crime was not necessarily the issue with the slaves. We could talk about that and how that practice did not line up with biblical law. There is a biblical form of slavery or servanthood, but that's another argument. But the great crime that the southern states were committing, according to the northern states and President Lincoln, was that they were opposing the political union that preserves our rights, liberty, and security. And we'll even talk more about this idea of security a bit later on the episode. But this shows us that the American flag really represents our American system. And in that sense, it is sacred in the American mind, especially among MAGA people and conservatives, because we have set up as Americans this idea that this three branches of government, the American system, essentially came down from God as a gift from God, and it is sacred and cherished. And if you are to go against this system, you are essentially committing blasphemy against our nation. And this is the result. Now, again, this is an executive order. There's going to be issues here. There's going to be laws involved and all these things related to this. But this is part and parcel with the American system. The president issuing an executive order, which is in many ways, in some ways, functions as new legislation. It says, okay, here's a new rule. If you do this, then this will happen. And again, this is contrary to the theonomic position, to Lancastrian theonomy, which argues for the sufficiency of God's law in terms of a standard of justice. So we do not need a new order or new law saying you're not allowed to burn this flag. In biblical law, the most sacred and cherished thing is the name of God. And that's why there is a penalty for blasphemy against the name of God. There is not a penalty for blaspheming, if you will, anything else. And there's a reason for that, and that is if you allow those laws or those orders to be set up to create penalties and punishments for blaspheming something else, that something else will raise to the level of the name of God in that society. And we should never want anything other than the name of God to be sacred and in our society. Because think about it like this, okay? I have no desire right now to burn the American flag. Now, there's a lot of things that the flag represents that I'm thankful for, but are also a lot of things the flag represents that I disdain and hate and abhor. The fact that this system has given us the murder of millions of children in our nation. It has given us the celebration of homosexual relationships. It has given us the acceptance, and it has brainwashed the people in the righteousness of taking people's money against their will in order to fund bureaucracy. So there's a lot about the American flag that, frankly, I hate. And that is going to be the case with any man-made thing. And that is why in God's law, it is only God's name that is sacred and cherished above all other things. So I don't want to burn the American flag because I think it's distasteful. However, in biblical law, there should be no penalty for taking any symbol or any idea and bringing it before the standard of God's word and finding it wanting and destroying it. Now, again, I think most people are burning the American flag. I get it. That's not what they're doing, but you have to understand the principle behind this. Think in the book of Acts of the I forget what city it was in, where they burned, was it Ephesus? It might have been Ephesus, where they burned all the books, right? The sorcery, witchcraft books. The people come together. There's a move of the Spirit, and the people come together and freely burn these books because they want nothing to do with this paganism. And this is not like a law where someone said, hey, you have to burn these books. We're banning these books. It was the people freely saying, we want to burn these books. Now, it's very possible that those books represented something that was sacred and cherished in that society. And it would have been fitting for that society perhaps to say, you cannot burn these books because they represent something sacred to our society. Now, that wouldn't surprise me if something like that happened, but as the gospel spreads and biblical law becomes supreme, nothing that man has created can be sacred at anywhere near the level of the name of God, especially in terms of justice and civil justice. Once you see, the problem here is not so much that it's part of the problem that, well, if you burn the American flag, you got the whole issue of prison. That's a whole other problem that is unbiblical, and this is just being perpetuated. We're going to throw people in prison now for burning fabric, and we're going to pay for them to be in prison for burning this fabric, and we are going to be forced to pay for them to be in prison for burning this fabric, and we're going to be forced to pay for the pension and the salary and the benefits of all these people who work in this prison system, which is one of the most corrupt systems in the nation. So be that as it may, biblically, you do not have a penalty for treating something man-made in a desecrating manner. Because once you give man, via the executive orders to the legislative branch, the ability to set something up on the level of the name of God, you are going to have injustice. You're going to have injustice, and you're going to have a system that is ripe for tyranny and unrighteousness. Because this is basically saying the one thing you cannot question and the one thing you cannot attack is our American system. And as Christians, everything should be subject to the lordship of Christ. And if the American flag and what it represents is found wanting, then not only should you not be punished if for some reason you decide to burn that American flag, but even more importantly, this is what's even more important. What's behind this is the idea that if you are going against the American flag and our political union, you are committing treason. And this is where it gets even more serious, because biblically there's a reason that the blasphemy laws and the idolatry laws are an important part of biblical law. Because in a biblical society, the sacred thing, the cherished thing, is the name of God, is God himself and his law. You think of the psalmist, you've exalted your word above your name, right? So the name of God and the law word of God are that sacred and cherished thing in a biblical society. And if you go against those, it is then tantamount to treason. And if you read some of Kenneth Gentry's work, he does a good job of explaining how the idolatry laws and the rebellious city are similar, at least in to help us think about this, are similar to treason laws in modern society. The difference is in the American system in modern society, treason is when you go against the American system. In biblical law, it's when you go against God and his law. All right, and so that's the difference here. So Trump is promoting the prosecuting people for burning the American flag, and I'm sure a lot of MAGA folks are really excited about this because they see a lot of very undesirable people, if you will, burning the American flag, hating the heritage of America, the nation they're coming over, in hordes to live in and benefit from. And I totally get that. And we'll talk about that briefly as we move on to the next topic here. I totally understand that. I have no sympathy for people coming to America to benefit from the great blessings here and then to mock and disdain the American culture. However, we have to have a bit more maturity as Christians than to react to that by abandoning biblical law. I do not want people coming into this nation who will be committing evil. I do not want people to come to this nation who will not put the law of God above every other system. These people aren't putting the law of God above the American. They're not, which I wouldn't recommend burning the American flag, but they're definitely not doing it because they're saying, hey, the American flag represents injustice and violation of God's law, and only God's name is supreme. And that's what, I mean, if they were doing that, you know what? That might be, again, I don't think burning the American flag is necessarily the route to go, but that's not what they're doing. I'm not defending the people that are burning the American flag, and I totally understand why people would react to that and say, you know what, this is good. Let's stick it to these people. Let's prevent them from coming here. And if they do come here and burn our flag, kick them out, throw them in prison, whatever. But that can't be the response that we have as Christians, because we are just substituting one problem for another. The reason that we have people coming here and burning the flag, desecrating our nation, is because we have abandoned God and his law, and God has given us over to judgment. The solution is not to abandon his law word further by setting up these idols and these things that we are placing at an equal level with God. I mean, this language that the American flag it's an idol in this executive order. That you cannot desecrate this idol that represents our political union, that preserves our rights, liberty, and security. This is idolizing the American system. It's saying it is our union that preserves our rights, liberty, and security. That is idolatrous. That is blasphemous. And this is what people don't understand. They think that it's no big deal to make statements like this. And they don't, we forget how the Bible talks about how important our words are. And frankly, from magistrates, how important their words are. Think of what is Herod in the book of Acts, who made this statement about how great he was, and God struck him dead. Now, God doesn't always do that on the spot, but it shows how seriously he takes our words and the words of our magistrates. And if this is not idolatrous, I don't know what is, because you are saying the most sacred symbol is this American flag, and to desecrate this flag is the clearest possible expression of opposition to that which preserves our rights, liberty, and security. And it is not God in this statement that preserves our liberty and security, but our political union built on this American Lockean 3 branches of government system that has given us reams and reams of laws and mountains of injustice. This is an idolatrous statement. And the thing is, conservative Christians, many of them, will applaud this because of the problem of immigration. And we're being blinded to the deeper issue here. We're being blinded to the reason that judgment is coming on America and is currently on America. We are currently experiencing judgment is because we have set something else up as our God. No, we haven't set up Molech necessarily, haven't set up these other pagan gods. And we have a lot of people. We have Hillsdale College out there and other conservative think tanks talking about how Christian the American Constitution is and how, what a blessing it was. It's still an idol when it is placed at this level. And the political union in the United States does not preserve our rights, liberty, and security. And frankly, it's not the magistrate's job to preserve our security. We'll talk about that briefly here at the end of this episode. But and the whole idea of our rights is another issue that we probably don't have time to get into. But biblical law, there is a place for quote unquote individual rights, but that is not the focus of biblical law. And that is why any claims that Lancastrian theonomy is akin to libertarianism or liberalism any of those claims are false, because biblical law does not place the individual rights as supreme. It doesn't even place liberty as supreme. It places justice as supreme. Deuteronomy, justice and justice only you shall follow. I think that's Deuteronomy 16:20, if I'm not mistaken. Justice is supreme in God's law. Justice then gives us, as a byproduct, rights, liberty, and security as a byproduct, not as a prime product. It's not the magistrate's job to give us liberty or give us security. It's the magistrate's job to simply render justice. So anyway, much more we could say on the flag burning. And I hope you can see the issue with this. It's not that, and again, I think some opposition would be, so you just want people to go around and burn American flags all the time. No, of course not. But it's one of the things you have to understand, that the culture is very powerful. And this is something I think we need to think more deeply about. When you have biblical law, you do have more freedom compared to what we have now. And you therefore have the freedom to build a strong culture that would reject this sort of practice. But it would never place this man-made symbol and the American flag on the level that this executive order is. It would never do that. And this statement is an idolatrous, blasphemous statement, really, certainly idolatrous, it is claiming that this thing and what it represents is the highest good in the nation. And that is a serious sin that is being committed here. So again, I encourage you, whenever these things come out, don't just look at the surface, because at the surface level, it seems great. People that are burning the American flag. I don't like people burning the American flag. So therefore, let's throw them in prison. Our thinking has to be a little deeper than that. Okay, so that's a bit on Donald Trump's executive order on prosecuting burning of the American flag. Now I want to move on to a clip from Doug Wilson. Now, again, I said before, I'll say again, I appreciate a lot from Doug Wilson. I've read a lot of his books. His stuff on the family is phenomenal. I highly recommend his books on marriage, relationships, courtship, all those things. I do think when it comes to the civil realm, I think he has, I don't know if I'd say he's strayed, but I think there has been some development in his thought over the past 20, 30 years that I think he's going in the wrong direction. And I think his views on civil justice have become more basically boilerplate conservatism. Nothing really that he says is going to be very controversial to your hardcore Republican who's not even necessarily a Christian. And I think that's something to at least think about, that here you have one of the most prominent Christian voices whom I have a lot of appreciation for, but almost everything he says regarding the civil realm, I think could be accepted by kind of your standard average MAGA conservative. They might not come up with the idea of the Apostles' Creed in the Constitution, for example, but I don't think they'd necessarily have a big problem with it. But if he were to tackle things that the biblical law would, I think, require him to say, you know what, no, we can't have forced taxation, we can't have the prison system, I think he would probably maybe not have as much of an appeal to certain people as he does. But be that as it may, I want to play this clip on immigration because this is kind of demonstrative of a position that many Christians and Reformed and conservatives, whatever terms you want to use, hold about immigration. And we've talked about it before. I just want to play this clip and give a couple comments, and then I'll move on to the final segment here where I will talk about a local church here in Lancaster County that responded at least briefly to the position of Lancastrian theonomy. So that was great to hear people interacting with this and thinking about it. But first, here is this clip from Doug Wilson on immigration. This is from his recent CNN interview.
How would a Muslim or a Mormon or even a Catholic fit into your version of a Christian nation?
Yeah. So one of the reasons we have such problems with assimilating Muslims and all these different Hindus is that there are so many of them, right? So if we had a Christian republic and a Muslim came to Disneyland with his family, we have no problems. But when they fill up Dearborn, Michigan, that's just not. You can. It says in Amos 3:3, "Can two walk together except they be agreed?" You cannot put alien worldviews together, cheek by jowl, and have peace, right? So basically, I think a lot of the religious turmoil that we have, the clashes that we would have, could be addressed by a sane immigration policy, not a policy that tries to regulate what people can say or do in their religious convictions while here.
In that clip, Doug Wilson is talking about the problem of assimilation, and then he talks about alien worldviews coming together. Now, here is what we need to think about. Assimilation is extremely important, and it is something that in the biblical system is required by law. Here's what I mean by that. In the biblical system, one of the clearest principles, and we'll talk about this idea of quote unquote the principles from the Bible in our final segment here, but that is one of the clear things in biblical law in the Bible is that there shall be one law for the native and the sojourner. And so in that sense, assimilation is required by law, by biblical law, that if you come to a nation, he talks about a Christian republic, okay, we'll use that language. If we have a nation that has God's law as the law of the land, right? We don't need new legislation. We have God's law. Assimilation is de facto required by law because there is only one law. So if a Muslim comes over here, if a Hindu comes over here, he has to assimilate to the law of the land. The problem in our system is not what Doug Wilson said there. It's not that we have too many immigrants. It's not that they're filling up Dearborn, Michigan, or whatever. Now, I understand there are consequences of them doing that, but that's not the root problem. The root problem is that we do not have a mechanism for assimilation. And what happens is people like Doug Wilson and others say, well, here's how we're going to, here's how we solve this assimilation problem. We just try to keep these people out and let them come in slowly. But that doesn't deal with the assimilation problem. I would argue that the idea of us being unable to have alien worldviews put together, and that's what Doug Wilson is saying. He's like, look, this is not going to work. All right, we have all these Hindus coming in with their Eastern religious worldview, the Muslims coming in with their worldview and their desire for Sharia law, and then you have some Christians in this nation who want biblical law. It seems like most professing Christians don't, but we already have a bunch of different alien worldviews in America, even before the Muslims and Hindus Muslims and Hindus come over, because we have set up a system that celebrates different worldviews. Biblical law does not do that. It says, look, whatever your worldview is in your head, okay, fine, but here's the law of the land, and this is what is going to be enforced. This is the standard of justice. And if you come here and break God's law and someone brings your case before a magistrate, you will be punished. That is the biblical mechanism for legal assimilation by law, if you will. Now, there's also cultural assimilation, right? There's the idea that if you come to this nation and you don't want to learn the language, then you're going to have a hard time. And I've mentioned this before. One of the reasons this is another byproduct of man-made legislation and the abandonment of God's law. In America, our legislative system actually caters people coming from other nations and not wanting to learn English. We have laws on the books that require employers to cater to people who don't speak English as their primary language. That is a result of abandoning God's law, setting up the legislative branch, and now it's actually man's law that is augmenting the problem of immigration, if you will. It's augmenting the problem of assimilation. It's preventing us from assimilating people because man-made law is standing in the way. The solution is not a quote-unquote sane immigration policy, which is what Doug Wilson said there. And it's pretty much, that's again the standard MAGA conservative Christian nationalist even trope there, that we need a sane immigration policy. We got to keep these certain people out. Of course, that usually goes without saying. People don't say, well, yeah, it's going to cost us millions and billions of dollars via forced taxation to fund all these government workers who probably are going to be very inefficient and frankly are not going to be able to ultimately keep people out of this nation. We're going to spend all this money. We're going to continue to do the welfare thing, which is going to keep drawing people to this nation. Why in the world wouldn't someone risk their life to come here out of some horrible backwater nation to come to America that is still riding on the fumes of our Christian past, and yet now has mixed that and tries to syncretize that with a welfare socialistic system, which is not going to last. But right now, it's looking pretty good, right? We're getting the fruit of our Christian past, and we have all these free government programs. You're not going to keep people out. So it's unwise to fail to address one of the reasons that people are being drawn here, multiple reasons: welfare system, to an abandonment of biblical law. Now, I mean, in the past, at least, when you had our laws that were closer to biblical law, you wouldn't have people coming over here and saying, hey, I can come to America because I can get away with theft and murder and rape and I'm not going to be, executed. Now you have that. And that's not a result of our immigration policy becoming a problem. It's the result of us abandoning biblical law. So alien worldviews, the problem is right now we have alien worldviews legislated for us. I agree that you can't have a functioning society where the competing quote-unquote worldviews or competing worldviews are always in conflict. But we have a system now that creates that environment where the American legislative system has set up man, and the whole American flag executive order demonstrates that. It's set up this system as supreme, not the Christian worldview, not biblical law. So this system now is the highest standard, and you are going to therefore have all these lesser worldviews in the eyes of the American system that want to exist under this so-called American democratic system. So the assimilation problem is not solved by a sane immigration policy. It is solved by enforcing biblical law. That is what will force people to become assimilated. Because if you come to a Christian republic, and it's interesting there. I mean, I get what Doug Wilson's saying, and I agree that biblical law does not punish you for what you think or what you believe. But he said something like, it'd be better to have a sane immigration policy and just try to keep people out of this nation than to punish them for I think he even said what they do or say regarding their religion. And he actually has it flipped, because biblical law says, no, you can come into this nation, you can believe whatever you want, but there are certain things if you say, or if you practice these idolatrous practices, or if you blaspheme the name of God, no, you will be punished for that. And he's flipped it and said, basically, and this is lockstep with the American Lockean system, this false idea of religious freedom. There's a biblical concept of religious freedom, but not the way we've understood it in America. And so Wilson has flipped it there and said, biblical, the solution is to keep people out of this nation, but the ones who come in, not to, tell them that, hey, you can't practice your religion. Biblical law is actually the inverse of that. You do not keep people out of the nation. It's one law for the native and the sojourner. If you come here, though, and you commit evil according to God's law, you will be punished. If you come here and you are practicing open idolatry, then you will be punished. If you are blaspheming the name of Christ, who is the greatest and the highest being in our system, not the American flag, then we do have a law for that because it's in the law of God. So he flips it here, and this is what most Christian nationalists do. And I'm not saying Doug Wilson would say this. Again, I have tremendous respect for the guy's work. I've never met him. I don't know him, but what it ends up being is a rejection of the practicality of applying God's law in favor of man-made measures. It's saying, well, yeah, that's nice that God's law would punish those things, blasphemy and idolatry, and it wouldn't have an immigration law saying, hey, I'm going to punish someone for traveling across a border, which you'll never find in the Bible. But it's just not going to work to do that. And so we have to have a sane immigration policy. And I submit that we will continue down the road we are on, no matter how much money we pour into an immigration policy. Again, don't forget the unseen consequences of that. The further subjugation of the American people and financial subjugation, taxation, we miss that if you freed the righteous to take dominion and you had one law for the native and the sojourner, America would not be a place that Muslims want to flock to fill up Dearborn, Michigan. It would not be. It is only that way because we've abandoned biblical law. And it's kind of like that parable that Jesus talks about, right? With the man who has the demons, they're cleansed from him. But then if they are allowed back in, it's going to be 10 times worse than it was before. And I think there's an application there, at least in a very loose way, to the American system and what we've had in America. We were very close to biblical law early on, right? We never got it perfect. We were very close to it early on, and we were blessed tremendously as a nation. And so in that sense, the demons were cleansed from the land, right? These animism, paganism, it was cleansed from the land. You had great blessing in the land. But then we abandoned biblical law not long after, explicitly then, by the time of the American Constitution. I think that's the beginning of the end of the American system as we know it. And then the demons, as it were, come back sevenfold. They come back, and this is what you have now, this problem of a nation that was once so blessed, and it still retains some of the vestiges of that blessing, and it is therefore attracting all these demons, as it were. I'm not saying all these people that are coming are demonic, but I'm just using that as an analogy. It's attracting many of them who are following the devil. They're not interested in biblical law. It's attracting all the demonic influence, if you will, because this is a place that was once cleansed and blessed, and now it's a wonderful place to take advantage of. Because we've rejected God's law, we have the fruit of a previous Christian society, but now the structure is crumbling and it's just ripe to be taken advantage of. And what Wilson's arguing for is basically, hey, you know what? We just need to try a little harder to keep more demons from coming in. And the solution is actually not a sane immigration policy. The solution is repentance to get us back to the point when we were cleansed of these things. And that was by following God's law, repenting of sin, not trusting in man-made measures, and applying God's law. So you're going to constantly have people flowing into a nation so long as you do not enforce biblical law. It's going to happen. And as much as I understand the angst and frustration with people coming into our nation who hate our nation. The problem is that we have, frankly, given the demons free rein to come back into this land because we have, as a people, rejected God's law. And case in point, Trump's order, we have set up our American system as the highest standard. And when that happens, the American flag and what it represents will not protect us against demonic forces, Islamic forces, whatever. It will not. That is a classic case of trusting in chariots. And that is a case of man clinging to this idol he's created and continuing to claim that if we can just prop up this idol, we will have our rights, our liberty, and our security. And it will not happen. It will not happen. God will continue to judge this nation unless or until we repent as a nation and turn back to his law word. That's the only solution. All right, final segment I want to talk about now is a Sunday school series that was put on at Westminster Presbyterian Church here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This is probably, I guess you could say, the biggest Reformed church in the county. I think there are 2 services there. I'm not a fan of 2 services at all. Let me see if they have. I just want to confirm whether or not they have 2 services. Yes, actually 3. Worship service Sunday at 8 a.m., 11 a.m., and 6 p.m. So that's another discussion, but this is a large Reformed church in the past, and I'm sure they still do some like Ligonier conferences and very, well-off, huge church building. And this Sunday school series was on a theology of government for the church. Now, there are several sessions in this Sunday school. Let me see here. At least, if I can count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's 12 of them. I have not had a chance to listen to them all. And Luke Saint actually just released an episode on Think and Reform where he addressed at least one. I haven't listened to his episode yet. I wanted to record this first, and then I'll listen to his. So he interacted with it a bit. I'm not sure if he interacted with more than one of these sessions, but the session that I want to interact with is from June 29th of this year, 2025, and it's entitled Theonomy and the Relationship Between God's Law and Government. Now, there's a lot more. I would like to try to listen to most of these if I can, and there's a lot that we could probably comment on. Now, I did interact with the pastor there is Dr. Chris Walker, and he's the one who gave most of these lessons. A couple other men were involved, but he did give the one on theonomy that I'm going to play a few clips from. And I have already interacted with his views on civil justice and the magistrate in my book, Scattering the Sheep. I also have an episode on his public statements regarding shutting down his church. So I do have a bit of an idea of where he's coming from in terms of what the government's job is, and that will come up even in this episode somewhat. I think it'll probably be clearer in the purpose of government and the role of government. I didn't listen to that episode, but based on his previous statements, he's going to say, again, kind of the boilerplate, conservative, even Christian nationalist argument, which I don't think he would say he's Christian nationalist. But again, it's telling that their view of government is pretty much in line, MAGA, conservative, Christian nationalist. The government is there to protect us. And biblical law never makes that claim. The idea of security and protection, well, protection is the responsibility of the people, but there is a byproduct of security when biblical law is enforced, but it is not the role of the magistrate to protect us. Once you embrace that idea, you can justify almost any law because you can say, well, the government here, it needs to protect us even from ourselves. So anyway, I want to play some clips. Luke's episode, again, I haven't listened to it yet, but it will probably be much more in-depth in interacting with Dr. Chris Walker's comments here. And I certainly I've been trying to find people that are willing to debate theonomy. I reached out to Timon Klein, who's a big natural law guy. At first he responded, and then I haven't heard anything from him. Stephen Wolf, kind of same thing. They both initially said they were interested in debate, and then I'm still, waiting. I'm sure they're busy, and I don't sense any ill motives or anything, but it's just they haven't responded. It's hard to find, with all the Christian nationalists out there, it's hard to find one that will argue for their position against biblical law. And so, again, I would invite Dr. Walker, anybody at Westminster, anybody listening, quite frankly, in the area or willing to travel to the area for an in-person debate on theonomy. Theonomy versus natural law, Christian nationalism, whatever. We'd love to have those discussions and set up a space for that. But let me play a few clips from this. I'll make a few comments on it, and then we will be done for today's episode. So I have 3 clips to play from this episode. And again, they had some sort of kind of weird disclaimer on this, but so I guess I'll just mention, any clips we play are played under the idea of fair use. We're just playing these to comment, provide commentary and critique, and we're only playing very short segments. So if you want to listen to the whole series, you can go to, I guess it's westpca.com. Again, that's the website for Westminster Church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And let's start with this first clip from one of these Sunday school sessions. All these clips are from this session on theonomy and the relationship between God's law and government. Here is clip 1.
And so slowly the church was no longer under the influence of the Holy Spirit and under the authority of the Word of God, but they also were under the direction of the state. And so this is what I'm meaning here when I'm talking about if the government tries to come in and run or direct the worship of the church and the preaching of the Word of God, maybe even starting in ways that there's not an explicit Bible verse you can find to say, well, I can't do things that way or something like that. They're stepping outside their lane of authority and stepping into the lane of authority that God has specifically given to the elders of the church. And so that is an example of where I would hope as elders, if the government came in and said, this is the way we want you to do things, and you can't show us any Bible verse that says you aren't supposed to do things that way, we would still say, yes, but you're not the authority in that lane. You're not the one who directs and runs the ministry of the church and the preaching of the Word of God. So this is a third category. Again, you can see, I think, how this all fits under the head of you obey the government up until it asks you to do something that God says no to. It still fits under that category, but it's a little bit different than just an explicit command of Scripture. That's why I'm trying to draw this out, that God's given explicit authority to the elders of the church, to parents in the home, and if the government tries to take that away, that this would be a third category I see for legitimate non-submission to the government.
Okay, now I appreciate what he's trying to do there. That came after a series of arguments he was making, saying, first, we should obey the government unless they ask us to sin. But then he took it a step further and said, well, that's not always exactly the case, which I do appreciate. And I'm not sure if he's consistent with that, but he said there, well, it's not just if they ask you to do something that's not sin. It's also if they ask you to do something that they have no authority asking you to do. Now, I think that puts Dr. Walker in a bit of a difficult position because, his COVID stance, ultimately, he said, hey, you know what? The government's actually not forcing us to do this, but it's for our good, so we're going to shut down anyway. And again, you can read all his statements on why he shut down the church or just watch the previous episode, and I play a lot of them. I'll try to link to that below. But what he's saying here, he's talking about an example of some country, I think over in Asia, where the government came in and said to the church, hey, you got to do things this way. And it wasn't necessarily, quote unquote, sin for them to follow what the government said. But Dr. Walker there is saying, well, still, they shouldn't have done it because it opened the door for the government to run the church. Now, I agree with that logic. And here's the thing, though. I think Chris Walker will have a hard time being consistent applying that. Because what about when it comes to the family? What about when it comes to the business? Is it just the church where he would say, hey, you can't tell us how to worship? Or would he say, you can't tell the family how to parent, how to educate their children? Would he say it's unjust what the government is doing and they have no authority to be involved in any sort of education law? I don't think so. I hope he would say that, but I don't think so. Or what about, the family traveling and the family providing for its members in a family business? Is the government to be involved in telling you how you can do that? I mean, this is literally what our government does. It is involved in almost everything. And so if you take what he's saying there, he is correct to say it's not just that you obey the government unless they ask you to sin. I'm actually glad he didn't just accept that meme, because so many Christians just say that you got to obey the government unless they ask you to sin, which if you follow that logic consistently, it is insane. And it's not even followed in the Bible. Paul in the book of Acts, he's locked up and the magistrates say, okay, you're free to go. And he says, no, I'm not going. I want you guys to come to me. It wouldn't have been sin for Paul to say, okay, I'm going to leave the prison. He said, no, I'm not going to obey you, even though I could obey you and not sin. But there's a principle here that I want to make clear. And part of that is, right, that I am not responsible to obey any edict you give simply because you're the magistrate and simply because it wouldn't be sinful for me to do it. We have Christian liberty if we to submit to that order if it's not sin, but we also have Christian liberty to resist it and oppose it and disobey it. And that is very important. And later he talked about the American War for Independence, American Revolution, and how they were really operating just legally, and they were following, they were trying to appeal to the English Constitution. And there's elements of that are true, but there's also elements that they just frankly disobeyed orders and edicts because they didn't agree with them, which I think is valid. So I just wanted to play that initial clip because, and I want to share some things as I wrap up and play these final two clips. Kind of some Lancastrian theonomy basics, just reviewing some of the basics when it comes to biblical law. And I'll share more after I play these final clips, but I want to mention this regarding this first clip. And that is the responsibility of the Christian to the magistrate is obedience and submission. But it never is that obedience and submission to trump his duty to God to obey God and take dominion. So if I have a responsibility to God to take dominion and provide for my family, that trumps any lesser submission or respect for a man-made authority. So if God tells me to provide for my family and the magistrate says, you're not allowed to sell that bicycle because we have an ordinance against that, I reject the magistrate's quasi-authority because it's a false authority. It's a stolen authority. It is not a God-given authority for him to do that. And I obey God rather than man. And so I think this was probably the point in the session that I agreed with the most from Dr. Walker, where you're saying, look, it's not just if the government asks you to do something that's not sin, you have to obey. No, you got to think deeper than that. And I would just challenge him to push that further. And especially as we play, maybe, I'm not sure how much we'll get into it in these other clips, but he needs to be consistent with that and apply that across the board. And I think these are things that, frankly, many theologians and pastors have their doctorates in these things, but they just haven't thought much about what it means to have justice in the civil realm and the role of the magistrate. But we'll come back to some of these things. Let's play the second clip from this Sunday school.
The first thing that I want to do as we think through this question theologically is ask, how does God's law, the Old Testament law in particular, and then the moral principles in Scripture more generally, apply to how governments should legislate today? So first, let's talk about the specific civil or judicial laws of the Old Testament as found in Exodus and Deuteronomy. Should they give a pattern for governments today? Some of you may be familiar with theonomy. This is a doctrinal position, a theological position. The word theonomy just means God's law. And this was a movement under this title, at least, which largely began in the 1970s, though its thinking certainly had roots, largely in some maybe more back corners of Reformation thinking going back to the 16th century. And this movement in the 1970s argued that the Old Testament laws of God should continue to be the guide for our civil laws today. Now, this movement largely kind of receded to the background. It kind of had a heyday, seemed to disappear. And then all of a sudden, about 5 years ago, theonomy started popping up all over again. In fact, it was just a couple of weeks before our course began, I got my handwritten invitation to the Theonomy Symposium of Lancaster County. So it's here. This is a discussion that's going on. In fact, it's had a particular resurgence here in Lancaster and even has its own branch now called Lancastrian Theonomy.
Okay, well, I'm glad that the handwritten note, which was actually written by my oldest daughter, made it to Dr. Chris Walker. Unfortunately, he did not come to the symposium. Again, he's welcome to come in the future, and he's also welcome to participate in a debate on this topic, or anyone from his church or anyone else. Yes, so Lancastrian Theonomy, what this tells me, number one, is that this idea is gaining ground, at least here in Lancaster County, and it's enough of an idea that Dr. Walker thinks it's important to respond to. And so that is encouraging. I will note that it's interesting what he said there, that it just all of a sudden popped up during COVID. Now, I get what he's saying. There's kind of been a renewed interest in what the Bible says about the civil government because of COVID. That was a blessing. But to be fair, the idea of God's law and its application, it didn't like go away after the 1970s and 80s. I mean, I get what he's saying, if you just look at broad spectrum, but it's just been growing slowly and steadily. And many, many people before COVID were already thinking about these things. And I've said this before, it's kind of discouraging that a lot of these people, perhaps like Chris Walker, I did an episode where I talked about the guys down there at the Sword and Trowel, Graham Gundon and Tom Askell. You kind of just have this idea that these guys are like, well, we never thought of this stuff before, and how do we handle this? And yet they don't then go back to say, well, what were the people that were thinking about this for 20 years prior to 2020? What were they saying? And so I'm thankful at least that Dr. Walker and perhaps some of his parishioners are thinking about this more, and I would encourage all of them and Dr. Walker to come to our next Theonomy Symposium. I believe we will have another Lancastrian Theonomy Symposium next spring, maybe late winter, early spring, or late spring again in Lancaster County. That symposium I found it very encouraging, edifying. People really enjoyed the mock cases we did, and a lot of good interaction and a lot of practical application of God's law. So I think that's going to be a reoccurring thing for Future of Christendom, and I really look forward to the next one. So, he mentioned there, the question is, do we craft our laws based on God's law? And he will actually mention, I think, in the next clip that the position of Lancastrian Theonomy is that we don't even need to craft laws. So let me play the final clip. That's the one that probably has at least some more of the substance that I want to interact with. But I want to play that clip there just to point out kind of the way that he's thinking about this and what his perception of theonomy in the culture. And there is an element of truth to that there is a renewed interest. Certainly with Future of Christendom, it was not, it didn't pop up in 2020. Future of Christendom existed before. It was part of the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society, the work of Joel Saint and others going back years and years before 2020. And so what we are arguing, we welcome people that are new to theonomy, of course. And if COVID was an impetus to think about these things, praise the Lord. But it is not the case that theonomy was dormant for 40 years and then it just popped up out of nowhere. But anyway, I hope to see you at the next Lancastrian Theonomy Symposium. If you can't make this October's conference, try to make the Theonomy Symposium in the spring. We'll have more details once we nail down a time and date for that. All right, let's play the final clip here, and then I'll share some of my thoughts on the Lancastrian Theonomy basics, just to review some things. I think it'll be helpful for people. So let's listen to the final clip I have here.
So there's a wide range of authors in this group of theological viewpoints. So it's hard to really talk about what theonomy is and capture what everyone who subscribes to this word means. So I would say maybe you could think of it under a range. On the one hand, there would be the idea that we should update God's Old Testament laws to our context and times. So take the Old Testament laws, but update them today. So the Old Testament says you have to put a parapet around your roof, right? You got the flat roofed house. You got to put a railing to show that you don't negligently lead to the loss of life. So today we look for whatever ways we need to guard against negligence. We need to, upkeep our own property and have laws in place so that negligence doesn't lead to loss of life. So that would be one view, that we take the Old Testament legal principles from Exodus and Deuteronomy and bring them up to today. The other side, maybe the Lancastrian theonomy, says we should not have a legislative branch of government at all, as we already have all the laws we need in Exodus and Deuteronomy. We should only have an executive to enforce Exodus and Deuteronomy and a judicial branch to determine when there's questions of how it applies. So that would be kind of on the other side of things. So you've got this range of views here. So how do we think about this view? I think the consistent answer of our Westminster Confession and the history of the church has to start with the reminder that the ceremonial and civil laws of the Old Testament are no longer in force in requiring obedience of believers today. So we have to start here. More to be said, get there, but we have to start here. The Old Testament civil and ceremonial laws are no longer in force. The ceremonial laws, because they were fulfilled in Christ. The civil laws, because they were given for the rule of theocratic Israel. They were not meant to be a law code for nations to follow today.
Now, obviously, Dr. Walker says more. I encourage you to listen to the whole session and even other sessions in that series. I'm going to try to be fair to him, though, as I understand what he said. I listened to this whole session and what he is putting forth. The thing is, I do appreciate that he talked about Lancastrian theonomy. Again, this is an idea that Luke Saint mentions often, how John Bingaman has said, it's an idea whose time has come. This idea of has the American legislative system given us justice? Why not simply have God's law as the standard of justice and then have judges to adjudicate and have wisdom and prudence in the adjudication? So this idea is growing here in Lancaster County and elsewhere. Again, it's not new to us. It's not new to, Luke's book, The Sound Doctrine of Theocracy. I think does a really good job of presenting it in a real popular, easy to access form, but it's not new. With that book wasn't, not the first book that talked about this idea that God's law is sufficient as our standard of justice. But we are trying to spread this idea, and here in Lancaster County we have Dr. Walker, the largest Reformed church in the county, responding to Lancastrian theonomy, and so that's a good thing. We welcome these discussions, welcome the disagreement. Again, invite discussion, debate, and if you don't want to do a debate, let's just do a round table. Let's do a round table. Let's get 4 people in front of a camera and have an informal discussion on this. But you'll note here, and this is just anecdotal, and I know he says it's not his final thing, but this is what often happens, especially from Reformed, is to say, okay, here's the position, but let's just go to the confession right away. And the Westminster Confession says this, and therefore, it's no longer in force. He sort of just declares, it's kind of begging the question, he sort of just declares out of the gate, well, since the civil laws are abrogated, obviously, they no longer are the standard of justice. And throughout the whole session, I wouldn't say he necessarily defends that. He does quote some scriptures, Hebrews and the New Covenant, but I don't think he addresses the issue, and that is justice, right? He gives the standard argument that, look at Paul in 1 Corinthians and how he applies the Old Testament civil law to the church, and that's true, and it doesn't follow that because there's application of the law of God to the church that it no longer applies in the civil realm. If anything, and this is an argument that Greg Bahnsen has made many times, but I'm sure he's in Theonomy and Christian Ethics, if anything, it validates the idea that these laws are still standing, that they still have force because they're even applied, they're applied in the church. It doesn't mean that there's no longer an application in the civil realm. And I think Chris Walker would probably, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he would even agree with that from a logical perspective and a biblical perspective, just because you can apply an Old Testament case law, for example, and some of these don't necessarily involve civil punishments, but the ox, don't muzzle the ox, apply that to pastors. It doesn't mean that case law is no longer valid, that principle is no longer valid, and we'll talk about principles here in a minute. So I don't think he necessarily defended the assertion that the civil laws are abrogated. He sort of just declared it and then gave a couple proof texts. But I want to talk about a couple of basics that I think would be helpful to think through. And these would be some of the things I'd love to talk about with Dr. Walker, anybody from Westminster Church's leadership, or anybody that wants to discuss this. Later in this session, Dr. Walker does talk about, the principles from the Old Testament law and the Bible as a whole. They do reflect justice and righteousness, and they should be the standard by which we conduct our civil justice. And he has to say that, as if he's going to be, any sort of Reformed Christian, but he has to at least say, well, the principles of the Bible, at least the principles of the Bible, they do reflect God's justice and righteousness, and therefore we should appeal to them. What happens then is, and Joel Saint has said this often, God's law becomes the principles, and then our principles become law. He says it something like that. So when it's just reduced to that, if you will, especially the way it's applied, it basically is just kind of a tack on to the American system. Okay, well, here's our American system. That's sacrosanct. That's sacred. We're not questioning that. We're not going to question three branches of government. But now let's just kind of look to some of the principles in the Bible and see if we can fit them in to our American system. And that's not the way we should think as Christians. So but let's talk about principles, because I don't think that's a bad thing to say, that, hey, the principles in the Bible need to be followed. And this is a point that Luke Saint mentions regarding the Deuteronomy and don't add to the law. Where is that principle applied in the American system? But I actually want to talk about another principle, if you will, from Proverbs 17:26. To impose a fine on a righteous man is not good, nor to strike the noble for their uprightness. So here is a very clear principle in the Bible, and it's specifically related to the civil realm. And it says to impose a fine on a righteous man is not good, nor to strike the noble for their uprightness. So if we start there, right, this is again, theonomy basics here. If we start with this biblical principle that in the civil realm, it is wrong to punish someone for their righteous action. It is wrong to punish the righteous. It is wrong to strike someone, whether it's a fine or to strike them, punishment, when they have not committed unrighteousness. This is central. It's a foundational principle that, frankly, I think is missed in the hours and hours of rebuttals against theonomy. I just have yet to hear anyone make the case of what is justice in the civil realm and what is unjust for the magistrate practically to do. And here's this principle, this clear principle jumping off the page saying you cannot punish someone who is conducting their life in a righteous manner. Now, I've said before, if we just started there, how much more aligned with the Bible would our system be? Would the magistrates be? If you knew that you would not be punished as long as you are obeying God's law. And this is what Romans 13 is talking about. And he mentions Romans 13 in this series, and I don't have all the clips, but Romans 13 talks about this. And again, I want to provide this kind of these basic foundational principles to theonomy that I think would help people, if I can humbly suggest, that would even help Chris Walker think more about this. Romans 13, it talks about the authorities from God, but it says this: for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Okay, so again, this is why the argument is made that this is a prescriptive passage telling us what authority the magistrate has. Okay, it's not saying that whatever the magistrate says you have to do. It's saying this is what the magistrate may do. They may punish bad conduct. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Now, if we need to start there with this idea that the magistrate cannot punish you, is not authorized to punish you. He can, of course, if he has a gun to your head, he can punish you in that sense, but he's not authorized. It's not legitimate It is not a legitimate use of force for the magistrate or anyone to punish someone for committing righteousness, for doing righteousness. And if we simply started there, we would answer so many foundational questions that when you are punished for when you are punished for taking dominion, if what you are doing before God is just and righteous, and you're not breaking his law, and you are not blaspheming his name and not stealing from your neighbor, then you are not to be punished by the magistrate. On top of that, and we get into some more basics here, if you are doing wrong, someone needs to bring a charge against you and take you to the magistrate. There is not a body of enforcers going around looking for things that you are doing wrong. It is only when your neighbor, as it were, brings a charge against you. But you are not to be punished for righteousness. So if we are taking dominion, if I am taking dominion, if what I am doing is in line with God's word, then I should not be punished by the magistrate. Now, there are many things I'm doing now that are not in line with man's law, but I'm not violating God's law. Therefore, all those man-made laws, I have Christian liberty to disobey and disregard. And I should not be punished if I do so. Now, I may be punished because we have people who are sheep and are following the tyrannical leaders and are doing what they say, but it is unjust for the magistrate to punish someone who is obeying God's law. I hardly ever hear this talked about, and I've had conversation. Actually, I had a conversation with Dr. Walker, a private conversation, as well as another pastor. I don't know if he's still at Westminster, another one of their pastors, about these topics, and it's almost as if that topic has not been thought about. It's just almost as if this has not been thought about. What does it mean for the magistrate to commit injustice? It has to be more than kind of this general statement of, well, if the magistrate asks you to sin, then of course that's wrong. Or if he punishes you for refusing to sin, then that's wrong. Or Chris Walker tried to take it a little further and say, my alarm there. Chris Walker tried to take it a little further and say, well, it's not just that. It's also if they're doing something that they're not really authorized to do. Okay, let's take it the next. What is it that they're not authorized to punish you for? They're not authorized to punish you for righteous actions. What about this idea of the general equity? He talks about that general equity, and this is another kind of basic thing to theonomy. General equity, the idea of what's the underlying motive or meaning or purpose of this law. General equity has a great place, but it is to be in adjudication, not in legislation. Once you place the idea of general equity in legislation, you have no end to the laws that are created. But if you have it in adjudication, then you need wisdom and prudence for judges to look at each individual case, because every case is different, and then look to God's law and look to the general equity of God's law and give a ruling. Also, kind of as a side note, I was talking with a brother at church the other day, and we were talking about speed limits and things like that. And I brought this idea of customs. I said, customs are extremely important, and customs would play a tremendous role, and did play a tremendous role in biblical adjudication, right? If you have someone, if the custom of the land is to drive on the right side of the road, and you have someone out there who's driving on the wrong side of the road and driving extremely fast, and he harms someone, and a neighbor brings him before the magistrate, he can appeal to the custom as an evidence for the fact that what this guy was doing was reckless. You can appeal to the custom in adjudication to make your case, but you don't punish someone simply for violating the custom. You're not punished simply for violating the custom. It's part of an overall case for why what you are doing violates the general equity of God's law. But once you place that in legislation, there's no end to the laws that are created, and then people are punished preemptively for simply violating customs that have been turned into laws. So that's another kind of foundational thing with Lancastrian theonomy, is that the idea of general equity is applied in adjudication, not legislation. So let me just recap. One, if you are obeying God's law, taking dominion, there is nothing that the magistrate should be able to punish you for. And the next step is that even if you are sinning, that doesn't give the magistrate the right to punish you for sinning. So let me give you an example here. God requires me to be generous and help those in need. If I refuse to do that, I am sinning. But that is something between God and me, because it is not the magistrate's role to look at my income and determine how much should be given to what needy person. I have Christian liberty to choose who I give my alms to, if you will. Now, you have tithe to the church and alms. You have these different things. There's different views on that. But my point is, it would be sinful for me to be greedy, but that does not give the magistrate the right to punish me. So the magistrate does not have the authority to punish any sin. But if we even just start with the first thing, if you're a Christian person, if you're a Christian and you're obeying God's law, you should have, in a Christian republic, no concern that the magistrate is going to punish you. That's not what we have now, and that's not what we would have under Christian nationalism. Even this idea of forced taxation, pay taxes to whom they are owed, right? I would argue they're owed to those who are going to fulfill their duty. And taxation in the Bible, it is required by God to those to whom it is owed, but it is never punished by the magistrate. And so that would be kind of the next step. So the first step is you are not punished if you are obeying God's law. You should not be punished by the magistrate. Secondly, there are only a handful of things that the magistrate is authorized to punish you for. And again, it has to, here's a third principle, come in the context of adjudication, where your neighbor or an accuser brings a charge against you. So if you start with those three things, a righteous Christian taking dominion has nothing to fear from the magistrate. The magistrate is limited in what it can punish by biblical law. And third, you will only be punished if someone brings a charge against you before a judge and there is adjudication. And the fourth principle here is then God's law is appealed to as the standard of justice, and general equity can be appealed to in the adjudication, but not in crafting new laws. So anyway, I just want to make a few comments on that. There's a lot more we could say there. I don't think Dr. Walker really got into much substance on the question of the real heart of the matter, and some of those principles are part of the heart of the matter that I don't think he addressed. What is injustice? What is justice between a man and his neighbor? I think he was too vague. And he said, of course we look to principles of justice, but again, what about these principles from Proverbs 17:26, from Romans 13, from Deuteronomy? The fact that God is the only lawgiver. Where do those principles of justice get applied in our system? And I think that is the blind spot among many. And I would just encourage you to think deeper about these things. And I would love to see Dr. Walker engage on this topic a bit more. So, and maybe he got into more on these other sessions. I don't want to sell him short, but this was a specific session on theonomy. And so I was hoping for a bit more substance in terms of the actual arguments of theonomy. And it seemed to turn more into just here's the reform position. The civil laws are abrogated because of the new covenant, but that doesn't really answer any questions in terms of justice and how the magistrate can commit injustice and what our responsibility is. So if I have time, I'll listen to some more of these and see if we can provide some more content and interaction with Dr. Walker's content there. So I hope that was somewhat helpful, interesting. Check out Luke Saint's episode on Think and Reform. It was released just prior to this one. I'm going to listen to it myself now, and we hope for continued interaction and the continued spread of God's law and people thinking about this topic, engaging it, discussing it, debating it. That's a wonderful thing. Again, go to futureofchristendom.org and sign up for the No Other Name Conference. Hope to see you there this October. If you'd like to support the Lancaster Patriot podcast, go to patreon.com/the Lancaster Patriot. Until next time, remember that Christ, not man, not the American flag, not the American system, is king. So long, and God bless.